right, so this evening we have Betsy Dudash, and she is going to be talking about creating wildlife habitat in your home landscape. And Betsy is a Purdue-trained landscape horticulturist and landscape designer. She specializes with native plants. She's also a Wenatchee Naturalist. She's the board president of Sustainable Wenatchee, and she teaches continuing education classes at Wenatchee Valley College. She is a very enthusiastic and great presenter, and welcome, Betsy. Welcome back. So.
Thank you. I'm excited. All right, I'm sharing my screen now. This will stop other sharing. Do you want to continue? Yes. And here we go.
And Betsy's going to have several breaks in her presentation for questions, but feel free to put in questions into the chat as we go along, and we'll address them at that time.
Yeah, thanks, Kirk.
Yep.
All right, so we're going to talk about creating wildlife habitat in your home landscape. Here we go. Here we go. Okay, hold on. There I go. Okay, so it sounds like a silly thing to put here, but what do I mean by wildlife? And those of you who have bear and mule deer and elk or whatever, I'm pretty much not talking about them. I'm talking about, you know, in the home landscape. So birds, reptiles, amphibians, if you happen to live on a creek or the Columbia or a lake, mammals, and probably smaller mammals, and insects. And we're going to be talking a lot about insects, because insects, it turns out, are key to the survival of many larger animals, especially birds. Wildlife also includes, of course, pollinators, which aid plant reproduction and are critical to the health of terrestrial ecosystems. Because more than 85% of flowering plants worldwide depend on pollinators, and that figure includes, I think, 2/3 of the foods that we eat. And then about 25% of birds and mammals depend on fruits and seeds that are a direct result of pollination for their diets. So what do wildlife need? So first of all, they need protective cover and shelter, and they need these for a number of things. One of them is nesting and raising the young, staying safe during storms, and hiding from predators. Trees, shrubs, grasses, and perennials can all provide shelter to different kinds of critters. And if you have a big enough yard or enthusiastic enough, you can add bird houses, bat houses, and even bee houses. And I think you can get butterfly houses too to your landscape, and mason bee houses. I've seen those. As well as small piles of twigs and brush, having trouble speaking, provide shelter for insects and birds such as jays, the varied thrush, finches, juncos, and towhees, just to name a few. So they also need fresh water for drinking. Obviously, birds need fresh water to bathe in. Of course, if you have birds around your house and you have bare soil, you'll know that they also take dust baths, especially in the summer. They just kind of roll around and leave little ruts in the soil. And then this is just personal observation, because my neighborhood crow, he likes to soak or wash his food. Like he'll steal a bun from somewhere and leave it in the little tiny bird bath I have out front. And he's actually left small birds in there that he was in the process of eating and washing. So it's really handy for him. And if you want to make sure that insects get to eat, you just add some stones to shallow to whatever you have, so that they have a perch and they can drink safely without drowning. So water doesn't need to be something big, although if you have a pond or a full-size water feature or a creek, you're set. But as in my case, I just use a saucer, a big plant saucer, and it works beautifully. The trick is to get fresh water in there every day, and when it gets gunky, to clean it out. So wildlife also need food, and here's where we're going to start talking about native plants. So berries or fruit. A lot of plants produce berries or fruits, among them black hawthorn, which is also called the Douglas hawthorn. And here's right away, I'm going to talk about hawthorns for a second, because if you live somewhere close to an apple orchard, I think you shouldn't plant hawthorns. I think it's they're an alternate host for apple maggot, possibly. Kirk, you're nodding your head, so I'm gonna assume that's right, because I never remember. But if you live in orchard country, don't plant hawthorns without clearing it. Common snowberry, blue elderberry, serviceberry. This is actually serviceberry in the picture, I think. Oregon grape, smooth sumac, currants, and kinnikinick all produce fruits and berries. And then there's seeds, which of course birds and small animals eat seeds. So Douglas maple, ocean spray, Sculler's willow, and I'll have the Sculler's willow later too, but if you're wondering why I'm including a willow when most of us don't have water, this is an upland species and it can grow almost anywhere. In fact, I put one in my front yard last year, and I live in sandy, hot, dry Wenatchee, but my plan is to keep it cut back more like a small shrub than a large tree. But the great thing about willows is they're one of the first species to bloom in the spring, so they're really an important pollinator species as well. And then again, more seeds: purple sage, Idaho fescue, Indian ricegrass, wheatgrass, yarrow, sunflowers, blue flax, goldenrod. And then some plants provide nectar. And when we talk about nectar plants, it's usually for hummingbirds and butterflies. So ocean spray, elderberry, milkweed, fireweed, penstemon, and orange globe mallow, and finally pollinators. I'll call them typical pollinator plants because bees collect pollen from the flowers to feed their offspring. And if you're interested in pollinators, I did a whole talk on them a year ago. So you can dig that up and have a good laugh, right, Kirk? Yeah, it was fun. It was fun. So they also need protection from predators. Now, in my neighborhood, there's a lot of stray cats, and one of my neighbors is trying to figure out how she can capture them and then have them spayed or neutered, because if you don't get rid of them, you know, the cycle continues. So these kitties here are just looking outside from where they should be inside. Cats can kill a lot of birds and a lot of small creatures. Trees and shrubs create areas where birds and other wildlife can hide from, let's say, hawks and owls and dogs. In fact, I've seen, because we tend to have pigeons, we definitely have pigeons because I live near downtown Wenatchee. And I've seen a kestrel sat in my garage one time watching the pigeons, then 5 minutes later had picked one out, and there was, you know, hell drama. But yeah, I don't worry about the pigeons too much. But another thing you can do to protect wildlife from predators is to make sure that bird feeders and nesting boxes are at least 5 feet above the ground. And then as far as dogs, if you're a dog lover like I am, especially if you have a crazy healer who loves to chase birds, the birds know to, you know, fly away when he comes out unless they're really hungry, but he can't get in the area where the bird feeder is because there's a fence around it. There's a fence in a couple spots. So why are native plants so important? And again, this is going to go back to, we're going to end up talking about insects in the beginning here. So in a healthy ecosystem, animals control pests, pollinate up to 90% of plants, and disperse plant seeds. Animals, including insects, remember. So native plants are more ecologically productive than non-native plants because they have co-evolved over thousands of years with native fauna, including seasonal migrators. And when we use the term ecologically productive, it means that kind of the way it sounds, it means that animals are using the plants and they're contributing to the ecosystem. They're not just purely ornamental where they don't do anything besides photosynthesize. So most plant-eating insects can only develop and reproduce on plants that share an evolutionary history. So the classic example is monarchs and milkweed that a lot of people know about it. Just think about that on a much larger scale. So caterpillars, so plants that feed the caterpillars are critical. And I think that's the caterpillar. I snag all these pictures from the internet, but I think that caterpillar picture, does anyone know what species, what butterfly that is?
That's a monarch.
Is it a monarch? Yeah. And I think the one that has green is the swallowtail, right? Because I've seen swallowtail ones in person, but yeah.
They
So
have green and
notice,
blue.
yeah. So notice what it's sitting on, what it's munching on. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm pretty sure that is a milkweed leaf. But anyway, so they need specific host plants. And when I say need specific host plants, some insects, some caterpillars are very species specific, while others are adaptable to several species. It's the same with, it can be the same with nectar and pollen, where there are generalists and there are specialists. So some species, I think it's the same with birds too, where they're more prone to, I have to live on this plant, or this is what I eat. Whereas opposed to other species who can kind of forage more successfully. So thinking about that, if you add some of these plants to the landscape, you can feed caterpillars and help the butterfly and moth populations recover and thrive. Caterpillars, it turns out, as I said, are essential to the food web. They eat plants and then are often eaten by other animals, primarily birds, but also other animals as well. They're large and nutritious, and birds need thousands of caterpillars just to feed one clutch of nestlings. So without caterpillars, we wouldn't have birds. So when we say plants that feed caterpillars, that's the larval host. If you're looking at literature or lists of plants or the status of a plant and it says a larval host, that's basically what it means. That, hey, this plant, this caterpillar feeds on this. So among the many are Douglas maple, which is the little maple that I love, that's everywhere in the foothills. Again, the hawthorn, mock orange, smooth sumac, all the currants, the scholar's willow, and all the willows. But scholar's willow is the one that is most amenable to putting in a landscape. Kinnikinick, which is an incredible ground cover. Blanket flower, sunflowers, and blue flax. That's just some of them. So here's a point I want to make, because it's kind of the opposite of what the horticultural industry would have you believe. Native caterpillars munching on native plants is a very good thing. This is what we want. So, but if you're talking about invasive species of insects attacking primarily non-native species, yeah, I don't care about that. So yeah, I don't care about it. And you shouldn't either, because eventually, when you plant native plants and it attracts the right insects, eventually everything will come to achieve stasis. It'll all be happy. Things will work out. Okay, so you can do your part by bringing native plants home, bringing nature home. So most people think that, oh, we have all these parks, I don't need to worry about putting native plants in my landscape because, you know, there's all these parks and wildland and it's all going to be okay. Well, actually, that's not true at all. So parklands make up only 3 to 4% of the continental United States. Yards make up about 17% of total green space. And in cities, and I would include, you know, Wenatchee in that. It's a small city, but it's still a city. That total jumps to about 50%. So 50% of the green space is in yards. And as we all know, large swaths of nature being turned into housing and commercial developments. There is actually an insect apocalypse. People think you're exaggerating when you mention it, but billions and billions of insects are gone. And when I was a kid, because I'm old, you would drive at night and your screen would be covered with dead insects. And that doesn't happen very much anymore. It's been a dramatic decline. And in the past 50 years, North America has lost more than a quarter of its entire bird population. And that loss hasn't been equal. I think some species have been hyper successful and others are just quietly disappearing, but it's been about 3 billion birds, you know, have gone. So we are losing biodiversity of plants and animals, but you can help by planting natives that give wildlife a place to thrive. So my role here isn't to scare you, it's to kind of motivate you instead. So you're educated and you know why that's so very important. And before we start here, the statistics here, this study used chickadees. It's about chickadees. And I know that, I know that's not a chickadee. I know it's a robin. I just wanted you to know that. But aren't those little robins cute? They're incredibly cute. Here's just one case study. It was in Washington, D.C., compared chickadees in native landscapes and in yards dominated by introduced species. So when you say introduced species, just think of whatever you can buy at, and I don't mean to disparage any garden centers or big box stores, but they tend to all sell the same thing. And very few of them are locally or regionally native. So if you think about driving through Wenatchee or any town, and you see the same plants that need too much water, and they shouldn't be planted where they are, and they're native to the Eastern United States or China or somewhere else. Those are the non-native or introduced plants, okay, if they come from so far away. The non-native landscapes produce 75% fewer caterpillars and we're 60% less likely to have breeding pairs of chickadees. I mean, that's just in yards. The nests had fewer eggs, the clutches were less likely to survive, there were fewer fledglings, and they were slower to mature. So that's sad for birds trying to reproduce in non-native landscapes. But if at least 70% of the landscape is critical native species, the breeding bird population was sustainable and didn't decline. So look right there, in each of us in our own yards can change the formula, which is good. So why else are native plants important? One of the obvious reasons, because we live in a desert, or at least semi-desert, right? If you plant drought-tolerant natives, you're going to save water and money and labor. And especially if y'all got your water bills recently, or if you're on an irrigation system where you've been charged for repairs, or they told you that you're not going to have it anymore, or they're raising the rates. Water is not a limitless resource. And if you lived in Arizona, for instance, you're going to find out that you're not going to have access or unlimited access to water. So water is a huge reason to plant drought-tolerant natives. The other reason, another reason, is that they're very low maintenance once they're established. Now, I often have people tell me they want a no maintenance landscape, and that is just a myth. There is no such thing as a no maintenance landscape. But you can have a lower maintenance landscape with natives, because as the plants get established and fill in, they can outcompete weeds, but you're always going to have to weed. I don't care how old your landscape is. Another reason is that native plants don't need or want fertilizers, and the fertilizers get into the groundwater, or pesticides that indiscriminately kill insects and move up the food chain, killing birds and other animals. I think I just saw a story the other day about I think it was an owl that ate a rat that had been poisoned, and the owl died. I mean, this stuff, it doesn't stop. And then the final reason, besides all of these, is that instead of a generic landscape that looks like anywhere USA, your yard will reflect the beauty of our local wildlands. So those are all good reasons, right? I think so. Okay, any questions so far?
Yeah, just I haven't seen any come into the chat yet, but yeah, feel free to pop some in there.
Put them in the chat.
Okay, hi, Jean.
Well, go ahead, Jane.
Well, thank you so much. Just a couple of questions so far. You talked about the bird baths and the raven coming and putting his food in there.
My crow, my neighborhood
Your
crow,
crow.
yeah.
Okay, your crow. So, you know, that's kind of seems yucky to me. Do you have fun out
it is
there?
yucky.
And,
Well,
once
he
he's
was
done, I mean,
yes.
how often is clean for that? So that was one question so far.
Okay, so that question is that I don't have like recirculating water or anything, and it's just a very shallow bowl. So in summertime, I give them fresh water every day and I rinse it out. And if it gets really hot and it starts to get algae on it, I'll bring it inside and I'll scrub it out and keep it clean.
Okay, I will forego my second question because I see other people are asking.
Okay.
So Betsy, do you see the chat or do you want me to read?
I do. Let me scroll up.
Yeah. Is there a specific current that's native to the area?
There are three. The golden currant and the wax currant are really, and the red flowering currant. They'll all work here. Red flowering might need a little bit more water, but it is shockingly beautiful. So it's worth a little bit of water. And then, so native insects and native plants, they are, so yes, there's lots of data. I don't have it with me. I'm not an entomologist, but the relationship seems very, very clear. Native insects are very dependent on native plants. And just for one story, when my snow buckwheat blooms in late summer, just like that, it's covered with literally hundreds of native bees that you don't see anywhere else. Like there's these big black, so many kinds that you never see anywhere else. That's because they have that relationship. And when you're talking about that, that's another kind of unknown is whether cultivars of native species are as, good as the straight species. And the jury's out, but I think the inclination is to say, well, when humans are messing around with these, they may be getting rid of something critical. Like, so stick with the straight species. Sticking with a straight species is better. Yeah, the pile of branches, the small pile of branches that rats were a concern when I talked about this a couple of years ago. So if you have rats, I would say control the rats. I think people, they have those services, right, where they put those traps out and catch the rats. If that makes any sense, because I've seen a lot of those. How to deter rabbits. I have dogs, so rabbits don't come in my yard at all. I mean, even if they could get in the backyard, they wouldn't do it, right? Okay, I think that's it on that, right?
Yep.
Okay. And I hope I answered those questions. Okay, so now we're going to.
Betsy, you muted yourself.
I think you're on mute. There you go. Now we can hear you.
Okay. Come on. Okay, there we go. Now we're going to talk about native plants. So what I've done is for each group, I'm talking about what do they provide for wildlife, and then we're just going to look at a few species. And I'll give you some tips in that. I'm not going to go into great detail because like Derby Canyon website has huge amounts of information, or you can send me an email at some point. So native trees and shrubs form the structure or backbone of any landscape. As I mentioned earlier, they provide shelter from predators, not just dogs and cats, but owls and hawks and whatever else you can think of. They offer safe spots for nesting, and they produce nectar, pollen, seeds, berries, and if you're lucky, nuts. So two of my favorites are the Douglas maple on the left and the black hawthorn. Let me just say about the hawthorn, if you find that you're not near an apple orchard and you have a spot for hawthorn, hawthorns are famous for their thorns. We actually put one in and it's behind the garage on the alley. And I figure at some point, if it's hanging over the fence, it'll discourage anyone from tagging our fence because it's very thorny. But if you've seen them in the wild, especially around Leavenworth, there seem to be tons of them, and they are an incredible habitat plant, just incredible. Covered with flowers and tons of berries and lots of spots for nesting. They're great. Now the Douglas maple, I put one in my front yard next to the porch. They're a small tree, so they can fit in almost any landscape, really quite tolerant. And maples, all the maple species. So if you have room for a big leaf maple, I would go ahead and put one in. Or if you live up in Leavenworth, a vine maple, pretty much the same benefits of all of those. Serviceberry on your left. Serviceberry is, I think, my favorite shrub, native shrub, and I think everybody should have one in their landscape. You can squeeze it in. I have put a small one in the back, and as it turns out, the concrete in our backyard is however many decades old, is falling apart, so we'll be removing it, and we can put in more habitat, thus more serviceberry. And the middle is the red flowering currant, which is actually, as you see, not actually red at all. It's kind of a hot pink, and it's really, really a gorgeous plant. And then on the right is Oregon grape. And if you're like me, you kind of have a love-hate relationship with Oregon. It's a very unfriendly plant. I mean, it looks like a holly, but it's even sharper and more painful than a holly. However, if you see those flowers there, it is one of the species that it turns out is a critical early season pollinator plant, and it attracts a broad range of insects. Plus, then it has berries to feed birds. So there's a lot of good things about it. And if you put it, say, at the back of a mixed planting or somewhere where you don't have to touch it, it provides an evergreen screen eventually. Blue elderberry on the left and the smooth sumac on the right. Elderberry gets quite large, like really large. So if you have a tiny yard like mine, unless you plan on doing pruning, which is kind of, you know, native plants, one reason you plant them is so you don't have to deal with things like pruning and shearing and messing around with them. But if you have room, elderberry is terrific. Obviously, blooms and berries and habitat. Now, sumac, the best thing about sumac is the incredible scarlet fall color, but it's also extremely drought tolerant and will spread to form colonies, and it feeds animals as well. So if you have a really extreme area like a slope or something where you don't know what to do with it, and if you don't mind something that's, you know, 6 to 8 feet tall and it has room to grow, then sumac would be a great choice. Scholar's willow, I mentioned, it's on the bottom. So willows, like the willows are one of the earliest shrubs to bloom. So they're really important if you can find a spot for it. Like I said with mine, it's tiny. I put it in last fall, and I'll let it grow. It'll bloom, but I'll keep it cut back because if you let them grow, I've seen them quite large. And then on the right, the common snowberry in bloom. And snowberry is probably my favorite habitat plant around here because it's pretty low and it spreads gradually to form kind of dense masses and terrific cover for birds like quail. So if you love quail and you have quail, you probably want to think about getting some snowberry. And then I'm not going to show you many native grasses because Mel talked a lot about them last week, except to say they provide shelter, nesting spots. Insects might overwinter in their hollow stems, and they produce seeds that feed birds and other creatures. I think I have pictures of 2 of them. Indian rice grass is just terrific. It's just absolutely beautiful in a landscape. And then one Mel didn't talk about last week is bottlebrush squirreltail. It has been shown to be somewhat competitive to cheatgrass, which is one reason to try it. I actually put some in my front yard last spring. And then, but the other thing about bottlebrush squirreltail, the seed heads are gorgeous. However, it has seeds that you probably don't want your dog to get. So mine's in the front yard, not in the back, because I've heard that it can be a problem for dogs. And let's talk about perennials. They are an excellent sources of nectar, seeds, berries, and pollen. They make great perches for birds and insects. Some are also larval hosts. The ones with hollow woody stems can house overwintering insects and their eggs. And if you're gonna plant for pollinators, you want to plant perennials in groups or even large masses and make sure something is in bloom from spring until fall. And the hint here is that snow buckwheat, which you'll see a picture of, great late season bloomer and is my favorite native perennial. I just can't say enough good things about it. Let's show you some pictures. Okay, hold on. Hold on. Doesn't want to advance. There we go. I didn't know this about yarrow till but I have some yarrow on the side of the house. And then a couple summers ago, I was like, look at the ladybugs like it. And it turns out that yarrow is very attractive to beneficial insects like ladybugs and lacewings, parasitic wasps, and hoverflies. I mean, ladybugs there were all sorts of instars and juveniles on there. And goldenrod, same thing. It attracts parasitic wasps, other beneficial wasps, beetles, butterflies, and bees. Yarrow, as you know, is all over the foothills. It's pretty tolerant. It can grow anywhere. And Mel mentioned it as an option for a lawn substitute. I know that at some point, the neighbor's lawn must have had yarrow, or they had it next door because it has crept into our yard a little bit, and then the lawn has it, but you can mow it down. And then Canada goldenrod, which is a native one, but Mel also sells the Missouri goldenrod, and the goldenrod's fairly drought tolerant, but if you really want them, if you have kind of a moist area and you plant them there, they will explode, and they're just really terrific. Really terrific. A couple other favorites, blue flax on the left. I first saw it at my friend Jean's house and I was like, what is that? And it is beautiful. It's sky blue and very delicate. And then blanket flower. So the blanket flower that I'm showing you is yellow because that's the native here, I think, is more yellow, but you'll find it with red in it as well, and red circles. And this is a case where blanket flower, there are lots of cultivars, which means cultivated varieties, so horticultural varieties. So what I was saying earlier about cultivars is I don't think you can guarantee that the cultivar will be as attractive to insects or butterflies or other as well as the native species. Penstemons, the top one is a penstemon. I'm not sure what kind, maybe a Chelan, I don't know. They are incredible. They have different bloom times, bloom colors, and heights. I mean, penstemons can be a low mat, or they can be, 8 inches, a foot, and a couple are even taller than that. And most of them are really, really drought tolerant, and you get an amazing pop of color for a month or two. So they're really fun. And then the showy milkweed, which we all know for the monarchs, right? Recent studies have shown that milkweed is best at the edge of the property where the insects can find it. It's also, to put it mildly, a rather aggressive plant, so it needs some space. I had one plant, and I don't know how, it sends runners, and it does whatever it does. So if anybody needs milkweed seeds, I have some from one of my plants. It's big, it's showy. Oh, and the other thing I should warn you about, it attracts aphids. Someone said to me, don't you have aphids? And I'm like, no. And then a month later, aphids. So it's another reason to kind of plant them on the edge of your property away from other plants, because nasty, right? There is snow buckwheat. So snow buckwheat on the left, that's actually my front yard right near the sidewalk. And then creamy buckwheat and orange globe mallow. So the buckwheats, which you can get at Derby Canyon, you can get buckwheats, like the creamy buckwheat blooms early, late spring, early summer. The snow buckwheat blooms late summer into early fall. It blooms pure white, as you can see, and then it fades to pink. And then in fall, it goes to this rust color. So it's really spectacular. And those plants are where you just see the plant looks like it's moving because there are so many native bees on it. They ignore everything else. They love the snow buckwheat. It's incredible. The creamy buckwheat, I put in some last fall. And then orange globe mallow, I put in some plants last fall. And orange is a hard color to find. It's just an incredible plant in the landscape. These all have long bloom periods, about 2 months or longer. And they're very drought tolerant, which is good reason to love them. And then a category that a lot of people overlook are annuals, especially the reseeding annuals. I love annuals, and I'm not going to disparage zinnias or cosmos, but being a horticulturist, I like to kind of embrace what's something different and I try plants. My front yard is kind of an experiment, but reseeding annuals are used to fill empty spaces while other plants are growing. The first 2 years we were in this house, there were a lot of sunflowers. They were here before we moved in, and they just everywhere, the multi-branched, really pretty ones. Last year, I pulled out 90% of the sunflowers, planted some Rocky Mountain bee plant and some yellow bee plant to kind of mix it up. Plus the sunflowers tend to take over. I also have seeds for foothill clover, which I haven't planted anywhere yet. It's a native clover. And then I've put in some large flowered Colomia and Farewell to Spring from seed in planter boxes when we had that thaw in, I think it was in January, we had the thaw. So I'm trying them as well. This is Globegilia on the left, and that's the Rocky Mountain bee plant on the right. It's really pretty. It's not super big. Mel, yours is really big, right? But yours gets more water.
Yeah, it's growing along the edge of the lane. So it's getting all the runoff from the gravel. And I would say they're between 3 and 4 feet tall.
Yeah, like mine were about 15 inches tall.
Oh,
15 to 18, because I don't water much. And I have sandy soil. So the more you water those, the bigger they get. And they're pretty spectacular. Like yours they're spectacular.
Yeah,
and
really
they
are.
grow really quickly. Yeah. Okay, any questions about plants? And before you ask, that is ocean spray, which is an incredible shrub. So, oh, I'm gonna go up to chat and see what we have. Show chat. Okay, wait. Okay. Any recommendations for shady places for what kind of plants? Because, oh, yeah, we're good. So a lot of shrubs will take part shade, like a lot more shrubs than perennial. Okay, so common snowberry is great. I mean, I think probably ocean spray will take a fair amount of shade. And remember, when you buy these plants, they're not going to be giant. So you're putting in smaller plants, and you maybe want to trim a few branches to get them some extra light, but that'll be okay. The Oregon grape, which one of the currants? I think it's the red flowering currant would probably like a little shade too. And serviceberry pretty much grows anywhere. And perennials are trickier because most of our perennials are sunny, but if you're in Leavenworth and you have more moisture, you could do, oh, hold on, I'm distracted. But the native Achillegia. I need to switch.
Columbine.
Columbine, thank you.
Achillegia cerulea.
Yeah, so the Columbine, and then the beautiful, hold on, I'm looking at my cheater list because my brain, spreading dogbane will take some shade, and Tweedy's Lewissia, and showy daisy, which is one of my favorite plants. It's just really incredible. So those will all take some shade. So hold on, I'm gonna go back up. Germinating. Someone answered the black hawthorn question. Been known to host, yeah, it's an alternate host for apple maggot. That's why you can't have it near apple orchards. And then, so the trick about germinating, most native plants require some sort of, it's called moist stratification, where they are exposed to cold temperatures while being in touch with most moist soil. So the two of those, I put them in planter boxes. It's still winter time when I planted them, and the period required varies from like 30 to 90 days. So that's the trick, to either plant them in the fall before it snows. And we were laughing about this because last fall, none of us got to plant anything because it snowed really early. So October, or if there's a thaw, or you could put them in, I think, wet sand in the refrigerator. And after they've gone through that chilling period, you could then pot them up, but I don't have that kind of time. Yeah, columbine. I had sometimes trouble thinking of words. So who's this? Best bets for acidic soil. Yeah, that's tricky. So we'll have to think about that one. A lot of plants are surprisingly tolerant of a range of soils, and ours is kind of on the neutral end. So if you have acidic soil, you probably have a lot, you're in the woods or somewhere. So I would say if you have acidic soil and you're partly shady, I would add a lot of organic matter and then try shade plants. Does that answer your question, Kaylin?
Oh, hi.
Yeah.
I'm not actually in the woods. Thank you for answering.
Okay.
We're up in Leavenworth and
Okay.
in the Icicle Valley, and we just have acidic soil, but we have full sun.
Okay, so I would say don't go whole hog on anything, but it might be a matter of just experimenting. Are you pretty dry in the summertime?
Yeah, unless we irrigated, but the goal
Right.
would be to not, to irrigate as little as possible.
Right. So I would, in that scenario, I would definitely try a few different plants before you commit, or look them up and look at the pH range of the plants. It's known for a lot of them. You might have to do a little digging, but
Okay.
Okay.
And Betsy,
Thank you.
I don't know,
Yeah.
Betsy, if I can add something?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, so, that's just a natural soil feature for any forested sites, particularly well-drained sites. They tend to be a little on the acidic side. And so most native forest species are adapted to that. You would just be looking for more of like the, sun-loving type species. So
Okay.
we grow all of our native plants in media that is, pH of around 5 to 6. So most of the natives that we grow are very acid tolerant. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh, cool.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
not,
Thank you.
conifers do well, like below 5, other species not as well, but yeah, just a bit above
Okay.
that.
Thank
Great.
you, Mel.
Thank you very much.
Okay, good. Any other questions there? We got to move on, right? Okay. Here's where we get to the. Okay, so this is a picture of my front yard last summer. Yeah. So what have I done? We have very tiny urban yard, but we've managed to put in a lot of habitat. So yarrow, showy milkweed, and rabbit brush in the no man's land between the driveway and the house. It was just gravel. So I'm like, well, there's bare space, so I'm gonna plant it. And it filled in surprisingly quickly. None of these are, the yarrow and the milkweed were boom, especially after last spring. The rabbit brush are still small, but I expect them to take their time. They're not gonna get any extra water. I already talked about the hawthorn in behind the garage. And I put in snowberry and a vine maple that I bought from Mel, and we're considering it a horticultural experiment because hot, dry, and sandy soil and non-irrigated, all those elements are against planting vine maple, but I kind of want to see what will happen to it, right? And it was a dead space. It turns out it was full of decades of construction debris. Every time anybody did something to this old house, they would bury it behind the garage. So had to clean that soil out. Added a serviceberry, more snowberry, and a red flowering currant around the old apricot. Put a golden currant, more snowberry, and a Douglas maple in the side yard next to the front porch. When I say I love snowberry as a habitat plant, I am not exaggerating. I mean, it's a terrific habitat plant. And the front yard is mostly perennials, buckwheats, penstemons, blanket flower, hairy golden aster, blue flax, and fireweed. So, and this is also my front yard right in front of the porch. That's fireweed, which I love, and Rocky Mountain penstemon, which it turns out is pretty easy to grow from seed if you have a little patience. So where do you want to put your wildlife habitat? So here's some recommendations, but really, you know your yard better than I do because I don't know it at all. So along your back fence or the alley, if you have an alley. So our back fence is on the alley, on the side of your house, along the property line for private habitat and privacy. And then if you have a large yard, because I know some of you have half an acre or more, you could plant a hedgerow. And hedgerow, you're going to do, it's multiple layers of different species of trees and shrubs, all kind of scrunched together, looks natural. Or turn part or all of your lawn into a pollinator garden. And Mel talked a bit about grasses, but yeah, a pollinator garden instead of a lawn, so much better because man-made lawns or the non-native lawns add nothing ecologically speaking. Okay, so what do you want to include in your wildlife habitat? If you have space, include a small tree. And I think I have the smallest yard of anyone I know, and I found space for a tree, a couple of trees, 3 trees at this point. So you can find a spot for a tree probably. And this is snowberry on the left, a different picture of snowberry. It's a dense shrub. Like I said, it'll provide shelter and cover from predators. Other dense shrubs, I would say, I'm talking about ocean spray as a taller shrub, as well as golden currant is tall as a background plant for screening and additional shelter. But one of the things I love about ocean spray is also very dense. So that would be a good shrub for shelter as well as for screening. And I can't say enough good things about kinnikinnick as a ground cover because it provides cover. Hold on, Mel. It provides cover and food for pollinators and small animals. It's an evergreen ground cover. What's not to love? And if you have a sunny spot, add bunch grasses. Like I said, I have some in the front yard. Perennials and annuals for cover, nectar, pollen, and seeds. So these are just a couple of. So let's talk about design. I'm just gonna, touch on this very, very briefly. I don't know how much time do we have? Very briefly. So, because design is, it's complex, right? But some basics. The most important thing will be to choose plants that match your site. So you want to look at the available space, the type of soil. And when I say type of soil, there's 3 kinds of soil particles: sand, silt, and clay. And every soil is made up of some combination of those soil particles. Like I said, my yard is very sandy. It's old river bottom, right? Very sandy. I could go a mile away in Wenatchee and a friend will have pretty heavy clay soil. So that affects, like my yard is perfect for the shrub steppe, super drought tolerant plants because it's really hard to give plants enough water in sandy soil. You also want to look at sun exposure, whether it's part sun, full sun, morning sun, afternoon sun. hardiness of the plants. Leavenworth is a zone 5, Wenatchee is a zone 7. So we can grow some things here in Wenatchee that you can't grow in Leavenworth. And the other factor is drought tolerance. So almost everything I've shown you today is pretty drought tolerant, except fireweed would like a little bit of extra water. There's a couple plants that want a little bit of extra water to really, be optimal, but it's not hard to do. So you're going to draw circles. If you look at this, so these are just snippets from a couple of my drawings. You're going to draw circles to represent the plants, and you're going to draw them to scale. And the scale 1/4 inch. If you get graph paper that's 1/4 inch, you'll just draw it at 1/4 inch scale, because you'll know that every square is a foot. So this DM, so these are Douglas maples, and OG would be Oregon grape, and the CS are common snowberry, but they're all drawn to scale, and KI is Kinnickinnick, and I just have quantities there. So just kind of a quick visual on how you're doing that. Draw circles, showing them at their approximate mature size. That's where it gets really tricky, because especially when you're talking about native plants, people are used to instant gratification, and they don't, they're like, oh, there's too much space. But honestly, perennials and grasses will fill in 2 to 3 years, and you'll be like, oh my gosh, my yard's too crowded now. My garden's crowded. What happened? So just plant, give everything enough room, and it'll be fine. But and I was talking earlier before we came online, I have a stucco house, so fire-wise isn't a huge concern for me as it would be with someone with wood siding. So, Al's going to talk about fire-wise next week. So if I were putting in a tree, and I do this in my yard, include other plants around it, because it'll be a long, long time before they're causing any trouble for each other. But if you look at fire-wise rules, they say, don't plant shrubs under trees unless they're a certain size. So Al will discuss that. I like to plant almost everything in groups and perennials in masses. There's a couple reasons for that. Is aesthetically, it's way better. And then for pollinators and say birds eating seeds, it's easier for them to hop from plant to plant rather than having to go foraging. Okay, let me see. Oh, and landscape. Yeah, are we out of time?
I was just going to say, yeah, 8 o'clock is kind of a soft end time.
Okay.
So if you need to go a few minutes over, that's fine.
Okay, I think this is my last important slide. So one of the things that people, if you're transitioning from a traditional landscape to a native landscape, you may have picked up a lot of bad habits. And this is a no judgment zone, but there are things that you shouldn't do. Number one is never use pesticides. And when I say pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, any fungicides, any of those. Avoid weed barrier and heavy layers of mulch. Insects that live in the ground or nest in the ground, reproduce in the ground, overwinter in the ground, can't actually get into the soil if there's weed barrier and a lot of mulch. If you saw my yard, you'd see that where there is mulch, it's just kind of little scatterings, or it's around shrubs that were recently planted. So there's a little bit just directly around the root zone to help them survive last summer. So, and in the spring, and we're coming on spring in a couple of weeks, you wait until the soil is consistently above 50 degrees and you see pollinators flying around. A good reference, if you know where there's an apricot tree, our apricot bloomed, it's almost gone now, before almost anything else. And that's when we'd see the first pollinators before doing cleanup, because cleanup essentially means that you're throwing away an entire generation, or potentially throwing away an entire generation of insects. So that's a scary thought. So don't do it. And during the growing season, I recommend not deadheading flowers because birds eat the seeds. And in fact, in a native landscape, like my front yard, I really only cut and clean up when something is a real mess. Like the snow buckwheat after this winter, I mean, it was under 5 feet of snow most of the winter because it's near the sidewalk. And I might have to do some cleaning up of those plants. But the goal is to reduce the time you spend in your garden. It shouldn't be manicured, it should be natural. And then if you have trees, leave the leaves. There's a little poster from the Xerces Society, leave the leaves. Many butterflies, moths, and insects overwinter in them. And here's something I didn't know, because I just don't pull my plants, even the annuals, until the following year. But I read somewhere that if you cut flower stalks at a range of heights, it gives bees a spot to go in and lay eggs and overwinter those eggs. So any final questions? Let me look up here. Okay, hold on. Let me see. Best bet I can. Arbor Day events had red flag. Yeah, and they ran out. They ran out of the red flying currant. Mel grows red flying currants as well, and they're lovely. Clover yarrow mix has a. I don't know. And the thing about clovers is, I see a lot of clover, but I'm not sure whether those are native clovers or not. I know there are native clovers. So I would say I don't know. I would not mow very often. And if you do mow, I saw somewhere mow 3 inches. I'm going to say mow 4 inches high. The higher, the better. Bought the seeds, they water every day, but as long as, oh. Okay, I see. Thanks, Rachel. Thank you for that information. Anything else? Any other questions? We good?
Looks like it.
So, okay, and then I have some sources back at the end, and Kirk will share this, but seed and plant sources, Derby Canyon Natives, of course, but 2 mail order seed companies that I like, because you can get small quantities and you can get a lot of information about the plants themselves. I've ordered for myself and for clients from both of these. One's in Washington and one is in Colorado. And the second one gives you huge amounts of information. I mean, you can go through and look at the native range for everything they sell. And then here's some other resources. Mel and I will be handing out this Kittitas Audubon Society, one of their leaflets when we do a Bird Fest event. But there's some books and some other fabulous information. And if you need to reach me, there's my email. There we go.
All right. Awesome. Any other final questions?
Betsy, I don't know if I missed it, but there's this one question from Jeannie about seeds viable after overwintering. Do you compost or spread them around?
Okay, hold on. I missed it. Let's see. I didn't see that.
It's
What was
right
the-
after. It's right after Rachel's.
Rachel's comment down here.
Yeah.
Other seasons, whatever day.
While you're looking for that, I'm going to put in the chat the sign up sheet again, or form, if you're interested in the in-person workshop on May 7th. As I said earlier, it is limited to 25 people, so it'll be a lottery in April. We'll draw names from the hat. So,
Okay, I don't see the question, but if you harvest
I'll
native
answer
seed,
that, yeah.
Jean, are you still here?
Yes, I am. Betsy, with regard to cleanup, when you're cutting down all those beautiful pen stamens and things that have the seeds on them, do you push them around someplace else? Are they still viable? Do you stuff them under the plant, or do you just compost them and say they're toast?
So they're absolutely viable. In fact, under my Rocky Mountain penstemon, there's little seedlings. I don't know if you can see my hand that are probably a 1/4 inch tall. There's hundreds of them all crammed together. So like my friend Sherry will just scatter her native seeds in other parts of her property because she has a lot of room. You could probably do the same, Jean. If you have a smaller space, put them in an envelope and then put them in the refrigerator. That's probably the best way to handle extra seeds. But if you have bare spots and you just kind of want to let nature run its course, then I would scatter them, especially if it's something you really love and you want more of.
I love that the concept of cleaning up and just throwing it around.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. I look at mine and go, and part of it is that that birds will eat, birds and probably small rodents, if you have any, will go through your landscape, like in the, before, when it got cold and when we had the thaw, you see all of a sudden all the birds pecking around among the plants because, that's what they live on. So they're just going to find every little bit that's out there. Anybody else? Anything else here? Let me check. And then
Hand raised, but I don't see it anymore.
Okay.
They logged off or got their question answered.
Yeah, Western Native Seed, they're great. I love them. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Betsy. That was awesome.
Thank you, Betsy.
And so, it's obviously this was recorded and it'll be on our YouTube channel, and I'll send that out once I have it up there. And it'll also be the resources she put out, and a PDF of her presentation will be on our website. And I'll email that out once we have all that set up. So thank you very much.
Good night,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank
Again,
you.
Betsy, thanks everyone for joining.
It was great.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're
Good
welcome.
job, Betsy.
Oh, thanks, Al.
Okay.
You're up next.
Yeah, I'm up next. I'll see you next week.
Okay.
You guys are pros. Thanks again, Betsy. Have a good night, everyone.
Okay,
Good
bye-bye.
night. Kirk, I'll email you a PDF.
Sounds good. Thank you much.
Okay. All right. Good night,
Have a-
everybody.
Have a good evening. Bye.